And we talk about just these radical Republicans, and there's this leaning into fascism, incompetence, and fraud. And the National Republican Senatorial Committee is led by Rick Scott. Now, people have, I think, forgotten about Rick Scott's history. Rick Scott is the senator from Florida. He was actually the governor of Florida. One of the ways you rise to the top in Republican politics, like the bigger the fraud that you commit, the higher up you go. And Rick Scott, he founds this company in 1987. A federal investigation starts taking place in 1997, which is basically the hospital company that he is running is basically paying for referrals to get these kickbacks, which is a crime. You can't pay for kickbacks to get the provision of healthcare services. And he's doing this across the board. And an investigation takes place. He's subpoenaed and deposed. He pleads the fifth 75 to 80 times in connection with the investigation. His board forces him to resign. The company has to settle the largest Medicare fraud in the history of the United States, right? Oh, there's two different settlements, but they basically equal $1.7 billion. And his company gave him a golden parachute after he pled the fifth, because he did found the company, but because there's no accountability, if you're a Republican, you get golden parachutes in that world, and that's what they want to protect.
$300 million for stealing from Medicare.
Yeah. So the company gives him $300 million from stealing from Medicare. He then basically parlays that money to then run for office. So that's how he has all this cash on hand to become the governor. And it's kind of a very Trumpian thing too. You have to run for office because if not, you're a criminal. So you're going to be prosecuted for one of the crimes. But if you control the government, maybe you won't be, criminally prosecuted for the crimes that you convict. And then he runs for senator. He becomes a senator in Florida. But here's the thing. So then the Florida other senators put this guy in charge of all of their money. They put him in charge of the National Republican Senatorial Committee. So after all that background I gave you, they're like, this is the guy who we want to run our campaigns. And what does he do with most of the money? Well, a lot of it, we don't even know where it went, because it went from $173 million to $28 million. A lot of the money that we do know was spent. People called it basically the National Rick Scott Committee, because he would do these weird ads on his agenda. And then his agenda was, we need to remove Social Security. We need to defund Medicare. And that's what he basically ran on. And so now they're down to $28 million. They don't know where the money they raised, went. And they're in these dire conditions at the same time. Democratic candidates are rising, and people are saying, we got to audit this. If this was a company, this would be a criminal investigation. No shit. If the Republican Party was anything other than a political party, which they get away with, it'd be the biggest Ponzi scheme, crime, fraud, cartel ring in the world. All they do is crime.
And Republican donors just keep giving their money to these people who just steal it. I was looking at a past article about Rick Scott as all this is unfolding. And so I dug up this Washington Post article from a few months ago that was speaking about Rick Scott's tenure at the NRSC. And this quote stood out to me, where it said, he, as in Rick Scott, has directed a sizable share of fundraising as NRSC chair to his own accounts. This is what happens when you put a common thief in charge of your money, Republicans. And Rick Scott just has to be the biggest liability for Republicans out there, because not only is this guy the guy who conducted the biggest Medicare fraud in our history. Let's repeat that again, in our history. This is the guy who they also have out there trying to set Medicare and Social Security policy for the country. And his idea is to get rid of Social Security and Medicare. He was the guy who was the person who put that strategy out there. I guess, he just wants to raid these programs for all they're worth, extract as much money as possible, and then privatize them so that he can make more money off of them. I mean, the plan is so obvious and in your face, and Americans are waking up here.
And, the biggest mistake, Brett, that Bernie Madoff made is that he didn't run for office as a Republican governor.
So it's really a great theory, but he could have been president. I mean,
Bernie Madoff would have became the president. So Rick Scott's fraud elevates him to governor and senator. Donald Trump, because he's the biggest scam artist and Ponzi scheme. Of course, the Republicans will exalt that person to president. That's who they are. That is
this is the most brilliant political theory I think ever. The Republican grifter theory is fantastic.
Like you've heard of the Peter principle. The Peter principle, right, is that the most incompetent person will keep getting elevated to higher positions, right? This is the Republican principle. The bigger grifter and fraud that you are, the higher position you will elevate to. And so we can call it the Republican principle. We call it the Rick Scott principle. We can call it the Trump principle. We talk about just these radical Republicans, and there's this leaning into fascism, incompetence, and fraud.